Behold, my glorious supporter Flipz has asked a response question to a question that they asked a long time ago. Flip says, back in August, I asked you to describe a music theory concept using Magic the Gathering concepts. I described scales or degrees of a scale by using ramp decks in Magic the Gathering that accelerate their mana and how they kind of skip turns. On turn 2, you'd normally have 2 mana, but the ramp deck is kind of skipping that and has 3 mana on turn 2. And here, we're going to explain a Magic the Gathering deck building concept exclusively using music theory and musical composition metaphors and similes. Good luck. I don't think I'll need it. These are two topics which at least I've been near for my entire life. Sure, what I'm going to talk about is why synergistic decks in Magic the Gathering aren't the be-all end-all. Why, making a deck that has elves, it's an elf deck, and you got your elf card that makes the elves better. You might be thinking, even if you haven't played Magic the Gathering, well, if there's a card that makes a type of card better, it must be better to play that card with those other cards. Otherwise, there's no use for that card. In other words, maybe there are decks that are good that don't revolve around a theme. But if there's ever a time that that card that makes other cards of a certain type good, surely the deck where that's good is a deck where you play all cards of that type, right? Yet, if you've played Magic at a high level, you know that's not true. In fact, it's quite bad to make a deck that is kind of like all tribal most of the time. Again, there are a few exceptions. Why? This really bothered me for a long time. I made an illusions deck, mono blue illusions in new Phyrexia standard, I think. And that was fun, but not good. And I didn't really understand why. It wasn't terrible. They're never terrible, and we'll talk about why. But I didn't really understand why. And, I think the trick is that it's kind of like chords in music theory. A chord, if you are unfamiliar with music theory in the extreme, is when you play a succession of notes, usually in a scale, together, and they create some kind of resonance because of a bunch of math crap that we're not going to get into. You play the first, third, and fifth note of a scale, and you hear this nice boom like that. And that sounds really good. Chords sound very good. You could argue that scales, like I used in my other example, and chords from those scales are the basis of music sounding good in general. And I think you are undisputably correct. However, there are problems with chords. Chords are not really problems, but disadvantages. Chords are not always the way to go. Why is there any point in playing something other than a chord? This is kind of a weird thing to say. If I just play chords all the time and then I play a guitar solo, we all agree that there's clearly a merit to the chord part and to the guitar solo part. There's those both deserve to exist, right? I don't really know how else to say it, but there's a way in which you think, well, if the chord is notes sounding better than the sum of their parts, why don't we just play everything as a chord? In the guitar solo, do we not do that because it's just impossible? Like we just can't play all those notes all as chords? I mean, you could do that. Why don't electronic musicians just program a guitar solo where every single note is a chord? Why not? Why not do that? That seems like it would sound all of the good. It would sound even good, more good, even gooder. I wanted to say, not even better. Why isn't that good? It's the same reason as why building a tribal deck, they're called, an all goblins deck, an all elf deck, is surprisingly not usually the best way to go. You usually, unintuitively, want to play the card that makes certain other kinds of cards better with not all cards of that type. Why? And we're going to explain why, comparing to music theory. Well, the reason is that there's a potential for anti-synergy. There's a potential for blowouts. In Magic, this happens where, you've made a deck where the cards are greater than the sum of their parts when they are together. But if anything else happens other than what you have planned, suddenly the things are worse than the sum of their parts. What do I mean by that? Well, here's another example. Not every note sounds good with every other note. Even if you know nothing about music theory, you know that there are times when you play a note with another note and they just don't sound right. They don't have that resonance. Again, there's a bunch of math crap that explains that we're not going to get into here. There are chords that are 3 notes that sound good, but not every combination of 3 notes sounds good. What do you think would happen if you played that guitar solo and every single one of those solo notes was a full chord? Well, what would happen is it would be nearly impossible mathematically for those notes not to contrast each other. You probably could do it, but it would be very, very difficult for it not to feel like just too much. And we'll get back to that point actually, but more to the point, a lot of the notes would just clash. You would be introducing such a web of math dependencies on which notes sounded good together that if, the one note, the individual note in that guitar solo made into a chord, that would sound good. But because there are other things happening, all those notes become kind of too much and it kind of buckles under the weight. It's the same thing with these tribal decks. If you make a deck full of synergy, the problem is if your opponent plays the game of Magic the Gathering with you, then your cards won't all be on the field at the same time, which means now we're just back to square one. If you just played a bunch of cards that were just good instead of cards with these synergies, then your one card on the field would just be good. You wouldn't need to worry about having other cards on the field for it to be good. It would just be a good card. Likewise, if you play a guitar solo, you could just pick notes that sound good. You don't have to worry about a million other notes applying. You could just not do that, and instead, guitar solos do sound good. Good guitar solos are good, right? And so there is a cost that must be understood to having a guitar solo where there's a million notes, or again, every note this is a ridiculous example, but you get the point. It's your fault, Flipz. This is the parlay you asked for. This is what you get. I think this is a reasonable but weird example because people mostly would not do that. I'm sure there are songs where people have done that. And again, in Magic the Gathering, it is the case that when your tribal deck, your all elf deck, does work very well, a lot of the time you just overkill your opponent. It's so good, you actually didn't need that level of power. If you have 3 creatures in play that are synergizing with each other or whatever, yeah, you're probably going to win most conventional low power games of Magic. But guess what would have happened if they weren't all elves? You would still be winning because you have 3 creatures in play and your opponent doesn't have anything. I mean, this is a very abstract example, but you get the point. From a theory perspective, in the situations where the synergistic decks are good, you won the game anyway. You don't need the synergy to win because if you have that many cards in play, you generally just win anyway. So there's no need to have this thing. Same thing with guitar solos. You're playing a million notes a minute and they do harmonize. You don't need more harmony. It sounds real good. You're fine. You can stop there. Not saying not to strive for excellence, but you get the point. There's a point where it becomes so heady that in the event that the person likes the guitar solo, there's simply no need to do more. And if they don't like it, they're only going to like it less if you add 500 more notes every 5 seconds. And it's the same in Magic. And so there is this kind of hedging your bets thing. Synergy is not bad in Magic. Indeed, I think one of the interesting things about Magic the Gathering and about music theory are that you balance the two. That even though chords sound good, and even though there's a place for individual notes, most songs use both. Even though having a deck with a lot of synergy is has its problems as a trade-off. Most decks have some kind of soft combos or synergies, and also a good number of cards that don't directly synergize. Or what's really popular in Magic is understanding how cards are marginally better with other cards. How if you're playing this kind of card is better than it would be. So put that in. They don't tightly synergize, but in the context of the deck overall, this is better, which is why the deck ends up being very good. It looks like, why is this pile of cards together? But in the context of this pile of cards, this one card is very good, and that's why the deck is good. It doesn't need any one card. If you are playing the deck as a whole, any of the cards, if you have any cards in the deck, this other card is a little bit better. And that kind of hedging your bets type of thing is what makes good decks in Magic most of the time. Now, again, there are disclaimers. People who play Magic all the time, please don't get mad at me about, like, yes, I know Goblins is viable in Modern and stuff like that. Right, there are exceptions. But a lot of the time, the reason that those exceptions are there are because every card in that Goblins deck in Modern or whatever synergizes with every other card in the deck. Like they all synergize. It's not a very tight synergy. It's just you can get every effect you'd want in your red aggro deck from a Goblin card. So you're just playing a mono red aggro deck and all the cards happen to say Goblin on them. It's not exactly the same as doing a tribal deck where you're playing cards that would be worse but are better if you have this card. You're playing cards that are good anyway, but all happen to be Goblins. That's not the same thing. There's a game design theory thing here that isn't really what Flipz asked about, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. But so I'm cheating a little here, where usually when you have a limited pool of cards, but they do cater to a tribe of creatures like werewolves or vampires or something, there are few enough options for those creatures that were made in the context of the other options that, the vampires you're gonna have access to will be of a very moderate power level, because the game designers know that in the very same set there is this card that makes vampires stronger. If you play them all together, we wouldn't want them to just instantly win the game every time you get these things. No, so we're going to make sure they're in line a little bit. But over the course of Magic's history, if you play in a longer term format, there have been enough really good vampires just out of context of some vampire buffing card that it is really good to throw a bunch of vampires. I mean, maybe not vampires specifically, but you get the point. Sure. Spirits is a tribe. Humans is a tribe people play. I can't really ever remember any time in Magic Standard where human tribal was specifically that good, but in Modern, a much longer term format, there are enough random, powerful, outside of context humans that you can put together, and again, just have a bunch of good in their own cards that are also all humans, and then suddenly it's really good. Another point to make here, kind of about this sort of good stuff strategy, is to trim it down. There's my runner-up thing was why, you can play 60 or more cards in a Magic deck. Why isn't it good to play more than 60? And there's lots of ways to explain this, but I've noticed over the years that a lot of players don't resonate with the actual explanations, basically. And so maybe there's a better way. When you play music, we can all understand that more notes does not equal better. You should pick the best notes because it kind of clarifies, it puts the emphasis on those notes. The song is riding on those notes, not a ton of notes, but like, what are the best ones? What's your good riff? Put that in. Don't put a bunch of other stuff in. Put in the good part of the song for this to make the song good. I don't know. And it's the same thing in Magic. It's easy enough to say like you're increasing the odds of drawing the best card you have or whatever. But a lot of players say, well, these cards are all good. And really what's true, the real explanation I was saying before, is that most new Magic the Gathering players don't know which of those cards are the best for that strategy, or it is unknowable which of those cards are the best. They're good in different ways. And Magic is simply a game where, like recording an album, you have multiple songs, just build multiple decks. Like, you make those be separate decks. A lot of the time, yeah, those are all good cards, but you could make two whole strategies around this, and they are marginally better for being more focused that way. You always benefit from focusing it more, which is why there has really never been a situation where somebody made a deck that had a good reason to be more than 60 cards, unless a card mechanically said they needed more than 60 cards. And there's been very few cases of that too. It's not like it never happens, but it's rare. And the reason is that you are always gaining some small thing, and those marginal benefits add up. Additionally, yeah, I mean, it just puts the fate more in your hands. If you play a bunch of random notes, who knows if people will like the song? But if you pick specific ones, I mean, if you're good at playing music, the song will be good. And if you're bad at playing music, the song will be bad. If you're not good at playing music, playing a ton of random notes actually might sound better than playing only a few notes because you don't know what notes to play. And it's the same as building a deck in Magic. You may find it sensible to play a bunch of cards in a pile, but that's only because you do not know which of those cards actually are better to play with those other cards. Or again, where to draw the line. So they might not be strictly better, but which set of 60 is a good set to distinguish as being a good set of cards to play with. I think we've gone down the magic and music theory rabbit hole far enough. Was that fun? Was this what you wanted? Did I cheat too much? I don't know. You said exclusively using music theory and musical composition, and I feel like I think I said this in the last one too, actually, when you asked me this question in reverse. I explained it both ways. Like, I just explained it itself, but then also gave the metaphor. I guess I gave the metaphor first, sort of. I don't know. Anyway, that was my take at it. This is, you know, like, easy and hard at the same time, because there are always, you know, I'm quite focused on the differences where it isn't a good metaphor, but, you know, maybe it is overall. It's hard to know what will be a good way to get people to understand. And I'm mostly talking to an audience where a lot of you know this stuff, you know, maybe even a good number of you probably learned it from me. So there's not a high chance that we're going to evaluate how good my metaphors were. It's hard to know. Anyway, a fun question for sure.